All right, we're here to talk
My
about the
first
data
point,
flows of new diffs, and we already started chatting, so we're not talking about whether the current state of the documentation is a good start. And the proposition from Thomas is to have a sequence diagram and then some details from APIs. But yeah, we'll cover that through the agenda. So Stanislav, you were talking about caching. Go ahead.
yeah, I think we maybe need to mention caching because it's heavily used right now in how we do things. And I think it will also help us better understand which parts of the caching we can use and which we can add on top of the next solution. That's my main point about caching. And the second one is about object storage. I know that backend engineers mentioned it already many times in previous calls that we switched to use object storage. Maybe that's worth including as well. Just want to hear your thoughts.
Remember that object storage apparently is optional, so not every GitLab instance will have it set up. Customers need to set it up. So if anything, yeah, you can document that it might be an option. Have we decided that yet? I don't know exactly how mature the conversation is with where we're going to cache what, because there's two parts. There's the template caching, there's the data that we're getting that we might want to cache it somewhere. Is that conversation already to the point of knowing that, Stanislav?
Maybe I misread the wiki. I thought it was just documenting like how the things are structured as of now. It's not like proposing a new data flow. Is this right to assume?
Uh, so let me just, I don't want to speak over Thomas, but the goal is to make it a part of the blueprint so that we can understand the development. What's your take, Thomas? What do you think it's useful for us?
In terms of like documenting caching or like that kind of stuff?
Data,
Or
like data flows overall.
yes. I think if it materially impacts the way that some so like the high level diagram, there are interfaces between all sorts of things, right? Like there's interfaces between the front end and the API, there's interfaces between the API and the back end. If caching makes any significant change to that interface, like I would imagine maybe between API and backend, because the cache might get in there and make it and like interrupt actual Rails from happening, then we should document that. If it's completely transparent, then I don't know if we would need to, but I'm imagining it's not completely transparent. So we probably should document.
You're muted.
Somehow you're muted. You don't.
Sorry. Yeah, it's the button. It's the button. I always forget. So I was saying that makes sense. I think it will be better to document, I think, because it does play a part in the overall scheme of things. And there's caching, but there's also persisting things on database like they do on the merge request diffs. And it will be important for us to document here that not all of them will be persisted in the database, just optionally. And then remember, I struggle with this sometimes, like there might be usages of diffs in the future that will use this, but are not diffs and repository, sorry, that are merge request and repository. So we need to be like, it will be an option in the way that the component is triggered or whatever. So there'll be an option there to make that. And I think that we need to document that it's an optional part. In terms of like the documenting current or the new, I think it's pretty critical that we give clarity on where we want to go rather than document what we have today. So I think in terms of like this part of the data flow exercise, Thomas, I don't know if you agree, you'll be more like forward looking about what are the things that are going to be part of new diffs and how do they play with each other and that sort of thing. Does that make sense?
Yes, I agree. The what is it? It's not really a risk. The extra work there is that we can write something down today, but as conversations go, we're have to update more frequently because it may not match what's. So it's like this document's going to have to be updated more regularly, which is just a more administrative work that someone has to do. People have to do. So
you're saying that this will get updated. That's fine.
Yeah, if we for going to here's how we want things to be, then that's going to be honed down over time. So we'll have to keep updating, kind of.
Okay. Remember, we're putting this onto the new diffs, and that will be the blueprint, right? But at a certain point, we're going to have to detach from the new diffs blueprint that was printed and published in a certain point, and we'll move to more technical documentation for us. And that's up to us to decide whether that is part of the blueprint or not. But that's a fair point. Stas, you have a very important question here about the proposed data flow.
Yeah, given that it is a proposal for how we are going to structure our data flow, I think there needs to be made some critical adjustments to the schema. I think our backend will support two different data flows. First data flow is server-side rendered HTML, like we'll be sending data with the HTML itself. And the second data flow will be web API, which we'll be using to add stuff on top of diffs. So I think it's worth mentioning that backend will do two things for us.
Okay. When you say web API, it's basically a public API that we're going to use to render diffs, but anybody can use it. Is that what we've talked, or?
Well, when I say web API, it will also do two things. First of all, it should be able to do server-side rendering, the same way we do server-side rendering with document request. And the second of all, it should be able to do also interactivity stuff. Like if we click on expand lines, it should handle that. Like if we add discussions, stuff like this, it should also be able to handle that. Yeah, I think that's it.
Okay. So if anything, the data that comes from the server-side rendered is a subset of the data that will flow through the web API.
I wouldn't think of
sense?
this as a subset of data. I think we'll have just data needed for the diffs coming with the server-side rendered markup. And maybe we will need some data to be requested as an additional request for some reason. Maybe we have some condition that based on client-side state. I don't know what it can be, but let's imagine we can have this.
I think, Thomas, like for us to document things and everything, I think what we need to know here, does this web API, sorry, Stanislav, this web API, is that what we're going to be streaming things from? So for example, the server-side rendered of the rest of the diff files, that's the web API.
Yeah.
Okay.
So when I say web API, I mean like us doing a fetch request to the server to get HTML and us doing XHR request to get some JSON data, for example. It's all API from the front-end standpoint.
What would you call this, Thomas? Like structured data versus server-side rendered?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, it's almost the difference between like data and display. We have two backend services, call them services. They're not actually, but, two backend services that are like, one is rendering output and one is rendering, just providing data. And presumably we have two different use cases for that. One is when we do SSR stuff and first display it, that's going to be fetching the rendered display output. And for other things, it will be fetching data. So I would say like display versus data or something like that. I don't know.
Okay, we can start writing it, and then eventually the naming will come out. I think I just wanted to understand how strictly web API was picked in our brains already, or is it just you're describing what it is? I think it's describing what it is.
it is going to be important that we differentiate those two paths. But I wonder if if that has an impact on the flow of data, because once that request comes in, let's say Rails is handling both of them, presumably. Once that request comes in, we could treat Rails sort of like, sorry, Igor, I know this is like oversimplifying it, but we can treat Rails like a black box sort of. And then, so the request comes in for whether it's a render diff or comments or expand lines or whatever. Either way, it's going to need to request out to cache or GitLab or the database. It's going to need to make those requests to gather the right information to either render displayed output or show data. And I wonder if it's really critical to differentiate between those two input paths if the internal connections are kind of the same either way. And maybe that won't be the case. Maybe for SSR stuff, like it'll only be cache or something, and so my assumption could be wrong. But
I think you just gave a great answer to your question. For example, where the data comes from might be set in stone. Like, for example, server-side rendered always comes from caching. And if you want to, like, you have to I don't know if that's the reason, but if that's the case. But I think it is important to document it somehow there. Maybe the data isn't changed, but I think it's important to understand, is it data that it comes like mushed into markup, or is it data that comes like in a way that I can work with? I think it definitely makes sense to have those two ways of accessing it documented, and potentially as two different entities in the system. Even if the endpoint is the same, we just change the parameter or whatever. I think it's important to understand, like, is it mushed data or is it like structured data kind of thing? I think that'll be useful.
Stanislav, do you think, so I'm going to propose an idea that I think is wrong, and then I'll propose a second one, and you say what you think is right. Do you think that this would be like in front of, in the chart in the wiki, it says like backend, and then I think it says web API, if correctly. Yeah, backend web API. Would this be between backend and web API, where it's like, here's the SSR option and here's the like data option? Or would it be splitting the backend into like SSR backend and then like data backend, so each can have different like data branches, or something else? Do you think something else?
I think we will be combining both the visual stuff and data into a single request. And that's just a better way to do it, simply because having two separate requests for rendered markup and for data would take us longer, because you would have to do the same operation twice, like fetch all the diffs and get all the data for them. So I think it makes sense, at least for now, to combine your rendered HTML and your data into a single request. And basically we'll be doing this single request to render your diffs. And in case we need something extra, like let's imagine we have some user preference that we are not sending with cookies. Like they wanted to show something extra on the diff side that needs some data from the Rails. We'll be making an additional request to the Rails in parallel with what we have in the first request. So basically we will have just one endpoint for all the diffs and some minor endpoints for interactivity stuff, like suggestions, discussions, and like expanding the diff. Like all these endpoints will be an addition to what we have. And also, backend will do this stuff for the server-side rendering without any additional requests. So when you load the page, it should do exactly the same stuff, just for a smaller amount, like for the 5 diff files as we discussed before. Like it does exactly the same thing. And also, if we are going for the faster rendering times for the merge request. Like our primary metric is like time to first diff. If we want to achieve that, I think the more data we pack into the first document request, the better it is for us, because we'll be able to render stuff much faster. And it makes me think we'll have less additional requests after we load the document. So as for now, I think if we have just one request, there should be enough for us to do the full interactive stuff and add something on top of it. For example, we render the diffs, we request discussions in a separate request, and add them as soon as the diffs are ready.
You said there's a lot of stuff you said that I opened a bunch of questions in my mind. I don't think we need to answer all of them right now. Whether how much data do we put on the server side rendered, how much data we get it separate. We don't have to answer that right here. I think eventually we'll have to see it in the browser, see how that works, and that'll be part of the spikes we'll be doing and everything. But the important part of that is the data itself. I think it's important to understand where it comes from and all that stuff. So I think we'll focus on that. I think will be better. Did you get your answer,
Maybe.
Thomas, about the splitting of the two things, merging them one to one? Is that what the answer was?
I think so. I'm gonna share my screen here real fast to just see what I think is the. Just share this. So this is just I just updated the that little mermaid diagram in the wiki. So basically, this just splits the single backend into two pieces. And I think this is, Stanislav, what you're talking about, where like in order to render diffs, most requests will just go to the diffs SSR endpoint, which will get fully rendered markup with data in it, all kinds of stuff. And then there's another like chunk of backend that is for interactive things that the user might do. And this is, of course, using the existing diagram, which may or may not be complete, but like both of them are going to touch GitLab database, probably. Who knows? Does that seem to cover what you're talking about, Stanislav?
Mostly, but I'm just a little bit confused about the web API point. Like, my mental model cannot comprehend like what this web API will actually do, because it does both interactive stuff and server-side rendering, and I'm not sure like what it is in the code.
Yeah. So I guess I would just describe it as like the web API interface does not necessarily represent our Rails classes. Like Rails can be a separate thing from our web API. It's probably provided by Rails, most likely.
Yeah, I think it's a mixture of like our REST APIs and the GraphQL and all that. Whatever we have to communicate with the front end, I think it's just the gateway of information. Because I feel like there's a missing like invisible box here around those three: the diffs, SSR, interactive B, and web API. That's all Rails.
Right. Yeah.
Today,
and the reason I have web API split out is because we may have a bunch of code in Rails that we don't provide to the API, but we can say when the API receives a request for rendered diffs, here's where it reaches out to into Rails, this class, whatever, these kinds of things.
Sure.
Rather than conflating the HTML or HTTP API with our backend code. That's the only reason those are split up.
Yeah, so once you put the box in, the arrows will become simpler because you just put the arrows to the bigger box from GitLab and database in Redis. Because you're going to have a Redis store on the left-hand side.
I don't know how to do this. I'd have to look it up. It's something like this.
Pasting it. Oh, shoot. I knew how to do this, but I don't know by hand. Anyway, you know what we're talking about, so we can wrap it up after the call. By having those three like storage like solutions, storage sources, I guess, Gitly, Postgres, our database, and Redis / object storage, whatever, caching. I think we can then start visualizing exactly those relationships with Rails. And then inside the Rails, again, Igor, I know that this definitely doesn't represent how Rails is structured, but in our minds, and a part of this, I think, one of the questions that came up when Stanislav was saying, you were talking about a bunch of things like suggestions, expanding lines. I want to throw this out there. Do we believe that those parts of the code will need to be rewritten for new diffs? I'll leave it at that. What does people think about that?
To be honest, I don't think so. Yeah, unless the logic changes on the front end side. Yeah, does it change like the way that we handle suggestions or all the other interactive side, like the colon code, or conceptually does it change? Or for example, we only change the way we display diffs in the beginning, or like for server side, using server side rendering, yeah, and all the other stuff, it like works the same as before.
Stanislav, do you think that we've changed anything meaningfully?
I think there are some stuff that we will need to add on top of what we have. For example, with the suggestions, we already have the pure lines code already in the data as of now. So we don't have to make an additional request to create like a block of suggestions in your text area. With the diffs approach, I'm not sure if we'll be sending our raw diff with the diff file. And that is something we need to consider during an implementation. Maybe we will need to do an additional request, like show me or even like fetch the whole raw diff file from Rails to then use it as a data model for suggestions.
So I think there's two things there. There's two things there. One is we're definitely going to need additional things. That's a given, right? But the question is, do we foresee like a major shift in how we access this information? Do we need a different API? And I think we've talked in the past about using public API endpoints only and trying to not use any internal endpoints that we're using today. I don't know if you've made a decision there. I think that was kind of like my dream, was to not have that happen. But I don't know. Did we make a decision on that? Public versus internal? Or do we have to see which ones that would be?
Well, I don't think that we made any decision.
Okay.
It would be good to use public API stuff so that we can sort of have the documentation standards for that, because I've used our public API and like it's not incredibly easy, but it's documented and like I can access it, and our internal API stuff is not exactly that way. So
to also answer Igor's question, I think the main goal here is to reuse as much as we can. No one wants to rewrite everything from scratch. And we also plan to reuse a lot of the front-end code that we already have. So the code we are using like for the discussions, I don't see any problem reusing an endpoint for the discussions already. So I guess most of the stuff should be reusable, and stuff that touches on the data that is existing in the diffs right now, that stuff may need some adjustments.
And I just went and checked, like for applying the suggestions and all that stuff, we're already using the public API anyway. So I think we can first see that there's core parts that are going to be updated, like how we get the necessary information for the front-end app to work. But at the edges of the app, like the adding a comment, the adding a suggestion, you mentioned, Stanislav, even retrieving the discussions. Remember, the discussions are shared with the overview tab. The discussions are shared with issues. So I don't think we should, or I think we should avoid having to rework discussions as a whole. But some things you mentioned were really interesting and clever, because one of the issues that happens today is if you comment on a unchanged line, the changes tab will never show it. But I think those fixes or anything like that would have to come from the backend perspective of awareness that there's a comment on the line and including that in the diffs initially. So I'm not entirely sure whether that would be a problem tackled by this new diffs initiative or a separate initiative to making the diffs a bit more robust in that sense. But I don't think that's a discussion necessarily for now. It's just like there's some things that will be reused mostly, but there are going to be some extensions that we're going to need to do.
So here to summarize, yeah, I don't think that we will need any rewrites here, unless some core concept on front end changes. For example, even with server-side rendering, I believe we still have access to like each line of the div, right? For example, for the suggestions, when we say apply suggestion, we like front end generates, I believe it's front end, yeah, generates the comment for a particular line, or do we fetch this data from backend?
Yeah, the front end generates it.
Yeah, so if we still have like an access to line by line for every div, then it shouldn't be a problem, for example, for this particular functionality. So yeah, the answer is I don't expect any like huge rewrite.
Thanks. I think you just hit one of our biggest questions is exactly how are we going to balance this thing between keeping the markup as lean and as small as possible coming from the server, but at the same time have enough annotated information that allows the front-end app to, attach discussions. And I think Stanislav's POC does a good job and from a non-optimized code perspective of matching those two things, but there might be improvements we can do to the current implementation of the POC. But anyway, that's going to be a great spike for us to dive into later. Not for now. Any more questions that we need answers to, Thomas? Oh, you have some other questions, Stanislav? I don't know if you want to go through that first.
I have another point about this graph, but we can discuss it after GitLab. Or we can discuss it right now if you want to. Yeah, if no objections, I'm kind of still cannot wrap my hand around the graph that is like connecting front end to web API and connecting web API to some backend services. I was going to suggest, and correct me if that is less obvious how to like wrap your head around that flows, but maybe we should go around request lifecycle or a page lifecycle. Like we have a document request, what it takes us to get the divs displayed. Like we do get request to the backend does request to database, returns rendered HTML, and after that the document or the client does additional requests, for example, to fetch discussions. But with the goal that it's clear that all the data is already there. Like we don't need any additional requests to work with the divs from the get-go. And we can add an additional diagram, like expanding on what backend actually does, like not just as a black box, but to also do separations inside the backend graph and tell it like, this is stuff to render server-side code. This is some additional endpoints, things like that. Yeah,
Stanislav, I think what you're asking makes sense, but I think that's covered by what Thomas suggested to use sequence diagrams. And I remember seeing this in particular on code suggestions work, where they were doing exactly like documenting how each step would happen in multiple systems. And this would be allowing us to get a perspective of what's happening in which sequence, from where, what is it triggering on other systems, So if we do something like this for this system, wouldn't that answer the questions you have right on that point?
Yeah, this is mostly exactly what I'm talking about. Like to
Good.
make it as clear, like how the data goes from the start of the request.
Good. That will be covered by the sequence that Thomas suggested. Cool. I'm going to put it here, yes. We can quickly ask Igor. Igor, do you know if Gitly is aware of MRs, or is it just Git-based operation?
So could you please clarify the question?
Yeah, so the question is, does Gitly know about merge requests? I think it only operates on a low Git level.
Yeah, merge request, it's more like application level, not a Git model. Yeah, like Git layers of Git model. Yeah, so the answer is they're not aware of merge request. Why I started to think about it is just the only maybe like small thing that is related to merge request on Gitly on Git model is the keep around refs. Yeah, for some points we like keep the head of the merge request, for example, in a particular reference. Yeah, so but apart from that, no. But if you have some specific question, then maybe we can discuss it. Yeah.
I have a specific question. We in the past we've talked about asking. I believe the almost the exact phrasing we've talked about is asking Gitly for the file paths for an MR. That was, I think, that we talked about. We'd ask Gitly for what file paths are in an MR, and then we would, paginate, or we would ask Gitly, hey, give me the diffs for these 5 file paths. How was that just a mistake? And
The problem is you're thinking about MRs.
Well, yeah, but I mean, that's what we've talked about before.
No, that's the thing. When Gitly knows about compared revisions.
Yeah.
So different 2 points in time, right? And he knows out of the Git diff which paths were changed. He doesn't even think about MRs. He just thinks about, you give me 2 things to compare.
Okay.
And you're the one giving it 2 specific moments of like
Okay.
your branch head and the target branch. Okay.
So when we were talking with Justin in the past about we'll ask Gitly about the MR, that was shorthand for we'll give Gitly 2 revisions and ask for the file paths between those 2 revisions. Okay. All right. That makes sense.
That's where I love it, because that's where like thinking about diffs kind of like makes us skewed in our mind, right?
Yeah.
But so I think the quicker we can like drop the MR only case,
yeah,
the better for everybody. But I do those mistakes, but yeah, that's it. It's covered by that.
Okay.
Nice.
That's an easy quick update, because I believe the sequence diagram I have has diffs in MR passing to Gitly.
Sure,
so we can just say diffs between revisions.
I think we can go to your third point, Thomas. I think you're going to have multiple sections in this document, in this wiki, so like section of data flows, whatever. What I would suggest is coming up with DRIs for each one of those communication layers, and then have them produce a draft or revise your suggestion. But those will be responsible for like filling those sections in or revising what you add. And by doing that, you can have like Justin check out the Gitly part and document it with proper terms of the RPCs that we're using, so that you don't have to go and learn Gitly just to do the diagram.
Right.
So we have to be understanding, like, I love that you're like moving this forward, but I don't expect you to have all the answers. So we're going to have to collaborate, and I'm definitely going to be suggesting putting names in front of this. Suggest putting names in front of each and having them produce/revise what you've produced. That's not how you write produced. There we go.
So we are going to add like a caching section to our high level thing. Are we going to treat all caching the same? Like Redis, object storage, all of this stuff is just caching, just one big caching bucket?
What do you think, Igor? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we should just use the word cache, and we shouldn't specify any particular technology here.
I think
Okay.
for now, because there's so many open questions about exactly which caching and everything, I think we just have some caching on the back end to cache stuff. And by what the arrow throws in there, so if you said, for example, if you have an arrow from server-side render to caching, you know your server-side rendering the templates, right? Or you infer from it. Where it's going to live, we don't care about right now.
I think at this stage we don't even need to include any caching right now. Like we need to just get the main data flow right, because I was thinking we are just documenting like what we have already, and for this new architecture we need to make the general model is good enough, and then we can add caching on top of it. Because right now if we start to add caching, we will just complicate things too much for us to understand. If that makes sense.
I can understand that, but we have had so many discussions already about caching that if we don't document like the role that we're thinking for it, here's what I'm thinking. I want people like, Bob or Stan, when they look at this blueprint, to identify red flags, right? And one of the things that we've talked about in the past as well is forecasting the impact of putting diff server-side rendered on Redis. Like, will that cause a bunch of evictions and cause a bunch of impact on the infrastructure? So if we don't include them, they won't think about that. But if we do include them at the high level, very vague, it might spark some conversations that will help us in the end. So I understand what you're saying about not including it. I'll potentially just make a reference on it, at least somewhere in the diagram. Because remember, you're going to have the top level diagram, but then you're going to have the detailed sequence diagrams for specific parts of the system. I think which one of these you want to omit caching, that's fine. But I want to have some entity of caching in the page of documenting data flows. Maybe we don't know all the answers, but having some presence, I feel it's useful.
Maybe we should include caching with the sequence diagrams, like make separate diagrams with caching and without caching, like worst case scenarios.
Sure.
Maybe we should do that, because that will give us even a clearer picture, like what stuff is improved in the data flow in general.
Okay, so what we're saying is, Stas, you said maybe omit them, it will complicate. And then I said, I want caching to be present so others can scrutinize it and potentially finding red flags. Then you said maybe in sequence diagrams, ones with, others without. Yeah, we can go with that, and then we'll see what comes out of the work. Because remember, some things will invariably benefit from caching, others no. So by doing the sequence diagrams, they will come up naturally. So we'll see. And then remember, the sequence diagrams have like different meanings for different arrows and all that stuff. So we can make that like optional, whatever, asynchronous or a bunch of things. So okay, Thomas, does that clarify what we want to do with caching for this point?
Yes. I think
Okay.
that it would go between web API and whatever the API is requesting, SSR or data or whatever, in there somewhere. You could put that in the sequence diagram.
Yeah, because you have to be Rails putting things in the cache. Like
Yeah.
you can't have GitLab talking directly to cache.
Right.
It has to be Rails controlling that. And again, I want to see this. I think Patrick will be probably the best person to do this asynchronously because he handles the persistence on database on the merge request diffs. It's about that optional avenue of, yeah, we get the diffs from GitLab, but then we persist them on the database. And what does that look like? Is it, especially in the sequence diagrams, how will it look like? So I think potentially that will be a great task for Patrick to cover. But yeah, sounds good to me. What other things do you need to know? What other kind of things?
I think that's about it.
Yeah, did we cover the second question you had? Well, what was the conclusion, if we did?
I think my second question, well, maybe we should cover it. So broadly, I think what Stanislav said earlier about like we should cover like how a page renders, that's going to cover most of this because we make certain requests and those requests are going to fill in with data and come back or whatever. And that may be all we need. I suggested documenting the API just like I did with the GitLab API here of like request files in MR and then request diffs for paths, but that may be a little too technical for this stage. So like really we just need like the sequence, the order, how do things happen. So
I agree with that. I think that makes sense. It makes things easier now, faster, and we don't really need, like, this isn't documentation for developers to implement. This is just for us to understand the interactions of systems. Yeah, that makes sense. So I think we need like systems and sequence of operations. That's it. That's all we need, I think. What I would write here is systems. How do they? Sorry, which systems exists? Which systems exist? Not systems. Which actors? Let's use the word exist. They interact with each other. That's kind of like my biggest thing. So sequence and systems. Yes. No. Just to give you a little bit of a summary there on the agenda. Okay.
So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to
ahead.
fill in extremely rough sequence diagrams here, like maybe even totally omitting things. Just be like, here's the beginning of a sequence diagram, and then I will assign them out to people. So for example, GitLab would be Justin. I don't know who else should, maybe you mentioned so like backend and caching, that should probably be Patrick, I think you said, or caching and database.
Persistence on database. So database.
Okay.
So let's sections. So database / persistence would be Patrick. GitLab would be Justin. What else do you have there?
Well, so
caching. So caching will have it, or maybe not. So
yeah,
we have a specific section for that.
No, not yet. That would be the one. That's like the major one that we need to add, probably, or it might be part of a sequence diagram rather than the high level one. And I don't know if we want to assign.
So we'll keep that there. And then we would need the front end. The web API.
That's probably, I mean, that's probably Stanislav, right? Stanislav, you're going to be the most expert on that part.
Yeah. So we have that GitLab, database persistence, and front end.
And then probably
pretty good.
The only other one would be any expert on going from web API requests into the backend, and maybe that's Igor. I don't know.
Yeah, so when we start putting names, then when I see the API and backend communication, then it's probably becomes not so clear what is the communication there, because like everything happens on the backend, so like there is no communication. It's just like it happens within one service, but at the same time we can treat it as a separation of concerns, I believe in some systems it's called like repository level, when you encapsulate the data model, like for example GitLab database or even caching, it's like one area, and then there's a code that is responsible for getting that area and form a request that form a data in such form that is clear to front end to use. Then probably in this case it makes sense to like separate API and backend API. But let's put my name for now, but I'll also
Yeah.
think about it.
A lot of
Maybe we
open
can-
questions, right? There's a lot of open questions, and I think I think you're the best person to figure those out and to kind of like tell us exactly what we need to know for that area. There's definitely going to be a pragmatical perspective here, just for everybody to hear this, is if you can reuse systems that already exist and they're not broken, we should. Potentially what might be of benefit is abstracting them into a same entity in our minds or in the code. Like, I don't think, so for example, if we already have suggestions in the public API, I think we don't need to move them or change them in any way. In other cases where, there was one thing that I mentioned. Oh yeah, the discussions awareness of the backend for the diff. So the backend awareness, whether a line that is not changed had a comment on, like if we want to create sort of this like diff line engine abstract concept to make our lives easier, like now is the time to talk about it, even if in the code they don't materialize that way. Or if we just write a service, I know that there's like services on Rails for a bunch of things. Maybe we can like create a new way of thinking about things. So we don't need all the answers right now in this documentation of the data, but for the implementation of things, we might wrap our heads around it different ways. But for now, we just need to understand the concept of things, and that'll be that. And so yeah, keep it at a high level, I guess, would be the TLDR. Cool. All right, I think we have a plan at least to get this moving. And again, it's still early. It's our first time to talk about this. Thanks, Thomas, to putting this together. Any other discussions we need to have?
Yeah, this work got me thinking that we have one very important and unresolved question for the backend. So right now we store diffs in the database. And I think object storage is used to store very big merge requests instead of database in that case. And this is the stuff that we will eventually need to document, like where the diffs are actually stored and how we get them. And with the streaming, it begs the question, can we get these diffs like just in a small portion, like the first 5 diff, for example, without waiting for the whole request? If we cannot do that with database, and if we cannot do this with object storage, we need to reconsider how we store the diffs in the persistent storage. Because that will basically nullify the efforts to display the first 5 diffs in the merge request. I know that GitLab supports like getting a portion of the diff. As far as I know, maybe we can use that. But definitely we need to investigate into this and see how exactly we are storing diffs and how we are getting them. Because we don't want to get 1000 files just to render the first 5. Like basically repeat the same mistake we do right now.
So what you're saying is if we have them persisted in the database, I think it's obvious that we will be able to get them partially, right? Get the first 5 files
I'm
or
not
something.
I wouldn't be so sure, because I'm not sure like what data structure we have in the database. Is it just a stringified object or what it is? I'm not sure.
Sure.
Wait,
are you asking if we,
Right.
let me just clarify this thing. Are you asking if we can get, like, out of a diff of 100 files, can we get just the first 5 and not have to deal with everything else? Not the way that we stream the data. That's a separate thing.
Yes, and it's partially connected. Like
right, because changed paths work that's happening in GitLab, it's paginated, right? You request a set number of changed paths and it can give you a batch, right? So that's paginated. We can also ask for the whole diff in streaming mode. Those are 2 different ways of accessing that data. I haven't seen confirmation that streaming will be built from GitLab over to the browser in a sustainable way. So that's the question. Partial, not stream.
Yeah, we need to figure out, first of all, how do we get diffs from the backend? Like all the ways that we can get the diffs, and do we keep our like compares in the database? Like, do we continue to go with that approach?
Sure.
That is also an important question.
I feel like that's an issue for tomorrow for the weekly.
Yeah.
Because that will help Thomas with the work of documenting everything. Will help this effort, but also like clarifies a bunch of things for us what we need. So could we create an issue for that, Stanislav, and then share it tomorrow on the weekly?
Sure. And the part that got me thinking about this is the graph for the Gitly. Like you see that it's in the wiki, it says we request files in MR, and since Gitly doesn't know about this, we have to fetch our ranges, commit ranges, and send it back to Gitly. That's how it works right now. Or we fetch the whole thing from the database, like the whole compare, and return it back without even touching Gitly at all, when we have it already. And there might be need for a change in this path.
What would make us need to do a change? What would be the answer that would tell us, okay, we need to rewrite that? Just so I understand it.
Simply, like, imagine a really big merge request that is like 1,000 files, and it takes us 5 seconds to get it from database. Like, we're basically delaying the whole page for these 5 seconds to display the first 5 diffs, and we're also delaying the second streaming request because we have to fetch it once again.
So yeah, we need to like 100% confirmation. I think at the moment I think quite sure that the data is granular in the database. Yeah, like we start like file by file, so it shouldn't be an issue. But yeah, by tomorrow I will have the confirmation. And regarding the external diffs, yeah, I need to refresh my knowledge on learn this from the beginning. But at the same time, I think maybe we can consider something like for external diffs, the ones that are stored in the object storage. Yeah, maybe we could consider the combined approach. Yeah, like fetching the first 5 files from optimized Gitly. Yeah, and then prefetch all the rest of the data from the object storage. So kind of. Like we taken this optimization from both worlds, but yeah, something to think about.
Yep, let's get that issue going. I feel like that will be providing a lot of answers for this. And you're right, like we need to understand exactly the consequences of putting things in object storage and all that stuff. So that's the job for the backends to figure that out and the issue. But we can ask the questions. More stuff. Thomas, are we good? We're at time, right?
Yeah, we're actually over time. I scheduled to 7:25, so or 25 after.
Not bad.
No, it's okay. Just don't want anybody to be late for anything or whatever. So I think I have some action items going forward. I think Stanislav, you're gonna open an issue. Igor, you're gonna brush up on all this stuff. Yeah. So
should we do another call next week this time?
Sure. I mean, if it would be
before
useful.
the weekly.
Oh yeah, it would be if it's useful. Yeah. Igor, you're
I'll be honest.
Is there a reason not to?
Should we do it? When next week?
Like this call next week, yeah.
At the same time.
Maybe let's discuss it tomorrow and see whether we have any questions. But what I wanted to mention, feel free to make it like later, yeah, because the 6:30 is
right.
Fine.
Yeah.
So
that was why we were laughing. Yeah. Okay.
Maybe we can continue like a synchronous discussion, but yeah, if we haven't eaten synchronous, then definitely we can have a call. Yeah.
Here's my thinking and just sharing that for just 30 seconds. This is sort of like one of the final steps for putting out a blueprint, a snapshot, right? And I would really want to have this conclude in 1610. And I know how easy it is to be waiting on somebody asynchronous to do their part and all that stuff. By having a synced moment outside of the weekly, kind of like puts a light moment on this topic. And I want that to be top of mind from every DRIs. That's what I was suggesting doing another synchronous call like this next week at this time. Even if we don't have an agenda, we can skip it. But at least if we do need it, everybody's kind of like focused on that agenda time. What do you think, Thomas?
Yes. I tell you what, I will schedule it. And then within the next day or so, I will do
Figure it out.
my part, which is like rough draft
Sure.
of all the diagrams. And then those people maybe can decide whether we need to discuss like more.
Then we can
think-
cancel it or not. Okay,
Yeah,
that works for
yeah.
you. Good. All right, let's go. I have another meeting.
Okay. Yep.
Thank you so
Thanks
much for this, Thomas, and
Yeah,
everybody.
thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Thomas.
Thanks. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.